I never thought leaving an HOA could feel like plotting a military operation. Honestly, I thought homeowner associations were supposed to keep things nice and tidy, maybe make sure nobody left their trash cans out for a week or painted their house neon green. Simple stuff. But HOA Karen, yeah, that's what I call her now, decided to turn every single decision I made into a crime against humanity. It started innocently enough. I moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago, all excited about the manicured lawns, the friendly neighbors, the little sense of community that people always brag about in brochures. For the first couple of years, I thought the HOA rules were tolerable. You know, the usual stuff: keep the grass trimmed, don't paint your house purple, don't park a boat in the front yard unless you wanted it to look like a Viking invasion. No problem, I could follow rules. I'm a rule-following kind of person. Then the fines started rolling in. At first I laughed, $50 for a mailbox color that didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic, hilarious. But when it kept happening every month, $50 here for the gnomes in my garden, $75 there for my hedges not being trimmed at precisely 3 inches because apparently nature has to conform to some arbitrary suburban ruler, I realized something was wrong. Not just wrong, horribly, absurdly, Karen wrong. I remember the day it clicked. I had just returned from a vacation, relaxed and sunburned, ready to enjoy my weekend, and I found a letter slipped under my door. I picked it up, expecting it to be a neighborly note, maybe a welcome back kind of thing. Nope, it was HOA Karen. The words practically leapt off the page like they were on fire. Failure to comply with Section 4, Paragraph 12, Subsection B of the Neighborhood Covenant. Immediate corrective action required. Failure will result in penalties. I stared at it for a full minute, then laughed so hard I nearly dropped it. Corrective action? For what? My tulips? My porch swing? Did she expect me to apologize to the rose bushes for letting them grow wild? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to live like this. Every tiny decision had to be approved by someone who clearly believed she had been sent by the HOA gods to police my life. I didn't just want freedom from fines. I wanted freedom from Karen's judgmental gaze, which somehow always seemed to follow me no matter where I went in the neighborhood. So I made the decision I would leave the HOA, I'd officially submit my paperwork, and I would reclaim control over my own property. Simple, right? That's what I thought, until I saw the way Karen reacted the moment she got wind of it. I swear I caught her staring at my house from across the street, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowing like she was hunting for clues in a spy thriller. I knew then that leaving the HOA wasn't going to be quiet or peaceful, it was going to be a battle. I spent the next few days preparing. I double-checked the rules, researched my rights, and even called a friend who had successfully left her HOA a few years back. She warned me, Karen types are the worst. They'll try everything: emails, threats, maybe even staging some ridiculous neighborhood intervention. You just have to stay calm. Stay calm? Sure, easy to say when your mailbox is under threat of a $50 fine for incorrect color alignment. And sure enough, Karen didn't disappoint. A week after I submitted my resignation, the notices started. Not emails this time, letters, sticky notes on my door, even a passive-aggressive phone call while I was watering my lawn, each one more ridiculous than the last. Did you know your mailbox is now facing northwest instead of true north? Immediate corrective action required. I held back laughter this time. Instead, I smiled and thought, bring it on, Karen, you have no idea what's coming. Little did I know that this decision, one that felt so simple and reasonable, would set off a chain of events that would escalate faster than I could ever imagine. The neighborhood was about to witness a showdown, and I had a secret advantage Karen didn't even know existed. But that story, well, it's coming up in the next part. Let's just say, when HOA Karen calls the cops on you for leaving her precious little kingdom, things tend to get complicated. I knew Karen was trouble the moment she walked into my life, but I didn't realize just how far she would go until the so-called mandatory HOA meeting. I'll be honest, the invitation itself was a little theatrical. It was written on fancy stationery with bold letters announcing my attendance was required for the good of the community. I almost laughed out loud. Required for the good of the community. What am I, a medieval peasant being summoned to the king's court for not tending my goats properly? But I went. I figured, okay, maybe it's just a lecture, a little scolding, then life goes on. Oh, how naive I was. When I arrived, Karen was already there, standing at the front of the room like she owned the universe. Her clipboard clutched in one hand, glasses perched at the tip of her nose, eyes scanning the room like a hawk about to dive on its prey. And there I was, me, a simple homeowner who dared to think independently, suddenly the enemy of the HOA state. Ah, there you are, she said, pointing directly at me with a finger that could have doubled as a gavel. We were just about to discuss your choices. She let the word hang in the air, dripping with judgment. I swallowed my amusement and nodded politely, trying not to smile. Karen launched into her spiel like a seasoned actor in a courtroom drama. Every word was precise, every pause calculated. Leaving the HOA is not just a personal decision, she said, voice rising theatrically. It's a threat to the harmony of our neighborhood. Every rule we enforce exists for a reason, and your decision to ignore them could, she paused for effect, destroy the very fabric of our community. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. I mean, really? Destroy the very fabric of our community? I hadn't even installed a pink flamingo in the front yard yet. I tried to explain calmly that I wasn't trying to harm anyone, that I just wanted to leave the HOA and live my life without constant fines and absurd rules. But Karen wasn't having it. She waved my points away like a magician dismissing a bad card trick. Your reasoning is irrelevant, she said. The rules are sacred, and as for your garden gnomes, she shuddered as if I'd committed some unforgivable crime. I stayed polite, nodding, letting her rant. But inside, I felt a mixture of amusement and apprehension. I had made a decision that felt so small, so ordinary, but watching Karen respond, I realized I had lit a fuse, and whatever explosion was coming, it was going to be spectacular. By the time the meeting ended, Karen had already started her campaign. I found sticky notes on my door warning me about potential fines, emails with threats of legal action for imagined violations, and a phone call in which she calmly informed me that all neighbors are watching. Watching. As if I'd turned into the villain in some suburban soap opera. I began noticing her across the street, standing with her arms crossed, peering at my house through binoculars, or at least it felt like binoculars. Every time I watered the lawn or took out the trash, I swore she was judging me personally. My friends laughed when I told them, but I could see the tiny kernel of danger in her gaze. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was personal. The suspense built as she escalated in subtle ways. Packages would mysteriously get misplaced, notes would appear on my car, and the neighbors started giving me the side-eye whenever she was around. It was like living in a soap opera where Karen played both the villain and the omniscient narrator. And here's the thing, while part of me wanted to laugh, another part of me knew I had to be careful. She wasn't just dramatic, she was cunning. Every move I made seemed to be observed, cataloged, and stored for some future punishment. It was exhausting just trying to exist in my own yard. By the end of the week, I realized two things. First, leaving the HOA was going to be far more challenging than I had imagined. Second, and more important, I had to prepare. If Karen was going to make this a personal war, I needed a strategy, and little did she know I wasn't entirely defenseless. But that story, well, it's coming. Karen's next move would involve something I never expected, her decision to call the cops. And when that happens, the tension skyrockets. Because when HOA rules meet actual law enforcement, things get interesting. I thought I had seen it all with Karen, emails, sticky notes, neighborhood lectures, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. One morning, just as I was sipping my coffee and trying to enjoy some peace, the phone rang. It was the local police department. Ma'am, we received a call from your HOA president regarding potential violations at your property, said the officer, calm but professional. I nearly choked on my coffee. Violations? What violations? I mow my lawn, I trim my hedges, I've never. Yes, ma'am, she said there may be some issues regarding compliance with HOA rules. The officer interrupted politely. I blinked. The HOA calls the cops over civic disputes now? I could feel the absurdity bubbling inside me like a pot about to boil over. I explained as calmly as I could that HOA rules are civil regulations, not criminal law. The officer nodded politely, but there was that subtle tone of, oh, this is already escalating, in his voice. Then came the doorbell. Two uniformed officers stood on my porch, looking official but slightly uncomfortable. I invited them in, offering coffee, trying to keep the situation calm. Karen, of course, had prepared her dramatic flair to perfection. By the time I opened the door, she was standing across the street, arms crossed, glaring at me as if I had personally offended the entire universe. Here she is, right here, she shouted, pointing at me with the intensity of a courtroom prosecutor presenting her prime suspect. She's violating the Community Covenant, Section 4, Paragraph 12, Subsection B. I stared at her, then at the officers, then back at her. She's pointing at me because my mailbox isn't pointing true north, I muttered under my breath, mostly to myself. The officers tried to mediate, flipping through the HOA's documents while I watched, amused and slightly annoyed. Karen handed them a folder so thick it could have doubled as a doorstop. Photographs of my property, garden gnomes strategically violating arbitrary rules, and even a hand-drawn diagram of how my porch swing was not in compliance. I could barely keep a straight face. One officer raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, these are HOA rules, they aren't criminal laws, technically you haven't committed a crime. Karen gasped like someone had just revealed a plot twist in a horror movie. But they're binding. she cried, voice rising to that familiar theatrical level I now recognized as Karen's I am righteous tone. I tried to stay polite, letting her tantrum play out. Inside, though, I was thinking this is insane. She's actually trying to use cops to enforce a civil contract. The humor was almost unbearable, the kind where you want to laugh but know that doing so might make things worse. The officers ended up leaving politely, explaining to Karen that HOA rules don't warrant criminal action and explaining to me that legally I was in the clear. Karen, of course, did not take this well. She stomped her way back across the street, muttering about next time and justice for the community. Even after the officers left, the tension lingered. I could feel her plotting, packing, and taking notes like a villain in a spy movie. Every glance in my direction carried the weight of her dramatic obsession. It wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore, this was personal. As I stood on my porch, taking a deep breath, I realized something important. Karen had no idea the next part of this story involved more than just HOA rules. She had no idea that sometimes the people you underestimate can turn out to be your strongest allies. She didn't know that my son, the sheriff, would eventually step into this drama. And that realization, well, it was oddly satisfying. Because the stage was set, the players were in position, and Karen had just made her first big mistake. She underestimated me, and little did she know, things were about to get a lot more interesting. Next time, Karen would learn that calling the cops over a mailbox isn't always the smartest move. And when that happens, the suburban battlefield becomes even more absurd, hilarious, and tense. I thought the cops' visit was the peak of Karen's insanity. I was wrong, so very wrong. Because after the official warning fiasco, she decided to go full Karen. And let me tell you, watching it unfold was like witnessing a slow-motion disaster movie. You know it's going to be bad, but you can't look away. It started small, or at least she tried to make it look small. First, a bright neon sign appeared at the edge of my driveway, non-compliant property under HOA surveillance. My neighbors walked by, trying not to stare, while I stood there blinking at this plastic monstrosity. I almost laughed out loud, but there was a part of me that knew better. Karen had escalated beyond petty fines. This was psychological warfare. Next, she somehow arranged a roadblock. Okay, maybe roadblock is dramatic. It was more like she strategically parked her SUV to block the end of my driveway. I couldn't leave to run errands without maneuvering like I was entering a stunt driving competition. And of course, she was standing there, arms crossed, glaring at me like I had personally offended the HOA gods. I tried talking to her through the fence. Karen, seriously, this is getting a little. I'm enforcing the rules, she yelled back, cutting me off mid-sentence. Every home in this neighborhood must adhere to the covenants. I took a deep breath and walked inside, muttering under my breath, yes, Karen, every home must adhere except yours apparently, because I've never seen a president with this much free time. Then came the emails, hundreds of them. Threats, admonishments, friendly reminders in all caps, and one particularly memorable message that detailed how my garden gnomes were now a threat to community morale. Yes, morale, apparently garden gnomes have feelings, or at least HOA Karen believes they do. Neighbors started noticing, too. Some were secretly amused, whispering as they passed my yard. Others looked concerned, and I couldn't blame them. I began to feel like I was living in a surreal sitcom. My daily life had become a mix of dodging passive-aggressive sticky notes, strategizing parking maneuvers, and trying not to trip over neon warning signs. But the suspense was building. Every move I made, every little lawn maintenance task felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of legal absurdity. I knew Karen wasn't going to stop here. She had already proven she was capable of escalating far beyond reason. And deep down, I had a feeling she was planning her next big move, a move that could involve, well, the authorities. At this point, I started keeping a little log. Camera on the porch, notes about each incident, timestamps of emails, just in case things went further south. Because if Karen had shown me anything, it's that she was relentless. A storm in sensible shoes, a human tornado of rule enforcement. And there I was, trying to live a normal suburban life while she plotted like a character in a soap opera. Humor was my only defense. I'd stand on the porch, sipping coffee, narrating the absurdity to myself. Look at her now, I'd mutter, blocking my driveway like I'm smuggling contraband instead of leaving my HOA, truly heroic. It helped a little to keep my sanity intact. Still, the suspense was palpable. I could feel that this wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore, it was personal. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was waging war. And I had no idea how far she would go next, but I knew one thing for certain. The next act would be bigger, louder, and somehow more ridiculous. Little did she know she was about to meet her match. And that match wasn't me alone. That story, well, that comes next. because Karen's obsession was about to collide with someone she never saw coming, my son, the sheriff. And when that happens, the suburban battlefield takes on an entirely new level of suspense. I had been bracing for Karen's next move, and deep down, I knew it would be spectacular. But I never expected just how fast things would escalate or how perfectly timed my little secret would come into play. You see, I have a son, not just any son. My son is a sheriff in the same county, and up until now, Karen had no idea. I'd never mentioned it because honestly, I thought it was irrelevant. But sometimes life has a funny way of giving you the edge you need at exactly the right moment. It started with another one of her emails. This one was particularly dramatic, complete with bold letters and multiple exclamation points. Your blatant disregard for HOA rules has left us no choice but to escalate enforcement. Compliance must be immediate. I laughed, then realized that laughing might not be enough. Karen wasn't bluffing this time. Her antics were growing more daring by the hour. The signs, the driveway blockade, the endless emails. She was escalating faster than a storm cloud gathering over a calm suburban street. I called my son that evening. We talked quietly, carefully. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting, but I also didn't want to leave him in the dark about what Karen was capable of. "Mom," he said, voice calm but firm, "I've dealt with my share of ridiculous calls. This sounds like a special kind of crazy. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I told him. "Mostly, but she's escalating and I have a feeling she's about to cross a line she shouldn't." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, good, because when that happens, I want to be there. Cue suspense. That line, the way he said it, sent a chill down my spine, not because I was afraid, but because I realized things were about to get very interesting. Karen thought she was in control. She thought her little neighborhood crusade could intimidate me, but she had no idea what or who was about to arrive. Over the next few days, I started noticing subtle signs that Karen might sense a change in the wind. She was still dramatic, still patrolling the neighborhood with her clipboard, but there was a tension in her posture that I hadn't seen before. Perhaps she was sensing that I wasn't as defenseless as I looked. Perhaps she was imagining consequences she hadn't planned for. Neighbors began whispering, too. Some noticed the subtle shift, like a quiet storm moving in the distance. They probably had no idea what was coming, but they could feel the tension crackling in the air. And I couldn't help but smirk a little at the irony. The woman who fancied herself the queen of the neighborhood was about to meet someone with authority she couldn't bully or manipulate. I continued documenting her antics. Camera on the porch, timestamps of each sign, each email, each act of passive-aggressive intimidation. It wasn't just for my own amusement anymore, it was preparation. Because when my son arrived, we needed the full picture. We needed proof that Karen had crossed every line imaginable and then some. Meanwhile, Karen's next move was coming. I could feel it. I watched from my porch as she stood across the street, talking to neighbors, flailing her arms, pointing at my house like she was issuing a decree. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, almost. But the suspense was thick in the air. Something was about to happen, and I had a front row seat. And then came the day. Karen made her next big move, calling the cops again, this time over some imagined violation that didn't even exist. She was escalating faster than I could react, but I didn't panic. Because I knew my son was on his way, and when he arrived, everything was going to change. It was a strange feeling, standing on my porch sipping coffee, watching Karen go full-blown dramatic. I felt a mixture of dread and excitement, humor and relief. The neighborhood soap opera was about to reach a new level, and the best part, Karen had no idea what was about to hit her. Next up, the confrontation begins. My son arrives, calm and authoritative, ready to face the storm Karen has created. And when he steps onto the scene, the tension skyrockets, and Karen's smug confidence starts to crumble. The day finally came. I could feel it in the air, the kind of tension that makes your chest tighten and your brain go into overdrive. Karen had outdone herself once again. Signs, emails, driveway theatrics, you name it, she'd tried it. And now she'd crossed the line again, calling the cops over some imagined HOA violation that didn't exist. I took a deep breath, sipping my coffee on the porch, trying to calm my nerves. Part of me wanted to laugh, part of me wanted to scream. But mostly I felt a quiet, simmering satisfaction. I knew my son was coming, and I knew that for the first time in months, Karen was about to meet someone who couldn't be intimidated with sticky notes and neon signs. When the sheriff's vehicle pulled up the street, I felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. He stepped out, uniform crisp, boots solid, and that calm, commanding presence that could make even the bravest criminal reconsider their life choices. I waved, trying to keep it casual, but I could feel the weight of the moment. Karen was already there, packing in her usual theatrical style, arms crossed, lips pursed, pointing at my house as if she owned every brick. When she saw my son, I swear I saw her expression flicker just for a moment. Confusion, surprise, a subtle panic buried under a mountain of arrogance. I wasn't sure, but it was delicious. "Good morning, ma'am," my son said, voice steady, professional. "I understand there's a concern regarding HOA compliance." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Yes, she is blatantly disregarding community rules. I demand enforcement." She gestured wildly at me like I had personally orchestrated some grand neighborhood rebellion. My son nodded, calm as ever, and pulled out his notepad. "I've reviewed the claims. As far as the law is concerned, HOA rules are civil agreements. There is no criminal violation here." Karen blinked, stammered, "What do you mean there's no criminal violation?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She tried again, but she's ignoring the covenants. She. "Ma'am," my son interrupted gently but firmly, "these matters are not enforceable by the police. Your actions, however, including harassment and intimidation, could have legal consequences." I could feel Karen's confidence cracking. She hadn't anticipated this. The woman who thought she could bully me into compliance with passive-aggressive tactics was now facing someone who knew exactly where the lines of the law were and wasn't afraid to enforce them. The suspense was palpable. Neighbors had gathered, whispering and peeking from behind hedges. I could feel their anticipation, and honestly, so could Karen. Her next move was desperate. She flailed, pointing fingers, citing rules and covenants, trying to act as though she had the upper hand. But my son remained unshaken. Every word he spoke dismantled her arguments without raising his voice. I couldn't help but smirk slightly. Watching Karen argue HOA rules with a sheriff, it was absurd, hilarious, and deeply satisfying all at once. She tried to regain control, flapping her arms and stomping her feet, but each attempt only highlighted her panic. I stayed quiet, letting the scene play out. There's something powerful about watching someone overestimate their authority only to have it crumble piece by piece. Karen was realizing, slowly, painfully, that she had misjudged the situation entirely. The suspense built with each passing moment. Would she finally retreat? Would she try something even more ridiculous? I could almost feel the tension crackling in the air, neighbors holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable climax. And then it happened. Karen froze mid-sentence, eyes wide, realizing that her little campaign of intimidation had backfired. The officer's calm authority and knowledge of the law were immovable, like a brick wall she could not bulldoze through with yelling or waving a clipboard. For a brief, perfect moment, everything went silent. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping, as if the entire suburban street was holding its breath. Karen's dramatic persona, the one she wielded so confidently, faltered. She was no longer the queen of the neighborhood, she was just a woman realizing she had overplayed her hand. I felt a strange sense of triumph, tempered by relief. The confrontation wasn't over yet, there were still consequences, but the tide had turned. Karen's reign of HOA terror had finally met a force she couldn't intimidate, and I knew that the next part, when she completely freaks out, was going to be something the neighborhood wouldn't forget anytime soon. I could feel it in the air before it even happened, the kind of tension that makes your stomach knot and your palms sweat. Karen had already pushed boundaries, called the cops, and tried to intimidate me with her endless rules and signs. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for what was coming next. The confrontation had reached a point where Karen's confidence was crumbling. She still strutted around like she owned the street, waving her clipboard and muttering about covenants, but her voice was sharper, faster, and edged with panic. I watched from the porch as she realized her little reign of terror was slipping out of her hands. My son, the sheriff, stood there calmly, like a rock in a storm, watching Karen flail. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't yelling, he didn't need to. The authority radiating from him was enough to make even the most arrogant bully hesitate. And boy, did Karen hesitate. You can't just," she stammered, pointing at me, then at the street, then back at herself, like she was trying to find the words to reclaim some shred of control. "These rules, they are important. I am protecting this neighborhood." "Ma'am," my son said evenly, "there's a difference between enforcing HOA rules and harassing a neighbor. You've crossed that line, and continued harassment can result in legal consequences. Do you understand?" Her jaw dropped, her face went pale. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, realizing that all her theatrics, the signs, the driveway blockades, the emails, the phone calls, hadn't just failed, they had exposed her to real legal trouble. For a moment, Karen looked smaller than she had ever looked, like the neighborhood queen had suddenly shrunk to a common mortal. She tried again, flailing her arms like a conductor who had lost the orchestra. But the covenant. "The covenant doesn't give you the right to threaten or intimidate a neighbor," my son said firmly. "That's harassment." It was the moment of truth. Karen's entire persona, the one she had built meticulously over years of HOA dictatorship, began to collapse. She screamed, she waved her hands, she tried to argue, everything became frantic, disjointed, almost comical if it weren't so tense. Neighbors had gathered, watching the scene unfold like a live-action soap opera. Some were trying not to laugh, others were wide-eyed, waiting to see if this suburban nightmare would finally reach its conclusion. And then came the final blow. My son, calm and authoritative, called for backup to handle the harassment charges and document her behavior. Karen froze. She realized that no amount of yelling, no amount of dramatic gestures, no amount of community spirit was going to save her now. I stood on the porch, barely able to contain a smirk. This woman had spent months trying to intimidate me, and now she was the one completely out of control. She was arguing with a law enforcement officer about HOA rules, and every word she said only made her situation worse. The suspense was almost unbearable. Would she accept reality? Would she fight? Would she finally be held accountable for months of petty tyranny? I could feel the energy of the entire street holding its breath. Even the birds seemed to pause, as if nature itself was watching Karen's meltdown. "Step back, ma'am," my son said, calm but firm. "This is your final warning before we take formal action." Her face turned red, eyes wide, lips trembling. She screamed, pointed, and stamped her feet, but the power she once wielded over the neighborhood had evaporated. For the first time, Karen was powerless. The woman who had built her identity around rules, control, and fear was now at the mercy of reality. I finally let out a quiet laugh, not a loud one, not mocking, just a small, satisfied laugh. Watching Karen freak out like this after months of her antics was sweet. Relief, humor, and vindication all rolled into one. The suburban soap opera had reached its climax, and I had a front row seat. The neighbors whispered, some giggling, some shaking their heads. Karen realized she had miscalculated, and her dramatic meltdown was only just beginning. But the story was almost over. The final act, the resolution, was coming. Because the next part, the part where justice is served, is where Karen finally learns that some battles aren't won with signs, emails, or stick-thin authority. Sometimes real power comes in the form of law, family, and a little poetic justice. After months of tension, drama, and borderline absurdity, the final act had arrived. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, had finally met her match, and I had the privilege of watching it unfold. It started with a quiet morning on the street. I was sipping my coffee on the porch, trying to enjoy a rare moment of peace. Karen, as usual, was packing in her usual dramatic fashion, clipboard clutched tightly in hand, muttering about covenants and neighborhood moral fiber. But there was something different this time. Her movements were sharper, her gestures frantic, her eyes darting nervously. The calm authority of my son, the sheriff, had changed the game entirely. When he stepped onto the street that morning, back up in tow, Karen's expression finally gave away the truth. Fear, real, undeniable fear. She had spent months terrorizing neighbors, sending emails, leaving threatening notes, and staging driveway blockades. And now she was facing the consequences of her actions. "Ma'am," my son said, voice calm but firm, "you have been engaging in harassment and intimidation of a neighbor. You are under arrest." The words hit her like a thunderclap. I watched her face go pale, her hands trembling, and the clipboard fall from her grasp. She tried to protest, tried to wave her arms like some kind of neighborhood general, but it was useless. For the first time, her authority had evaporated completely. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, whispering and craning their necks to watch the spectacle. Some were laughing quietly, some were shaking their heads in disbelief, and I couldn't help but smile. After all, this had been a long time coming. Karen had made a career out of policing my mailbox and my garden gnomes, and now she was being held accountable by someone with real authority and a real badge. As the deputies gently escorted her to the squad car, Karen tried to argue, tried to explain that she was just protecting the community, but her words fell flat. My son remained professional and calm, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. I stood on the porch, sipping my coffee, feeling a strange mix of relief, satisfaction, and amusement. It was almost surreal. This woman who had consumed so much of my life with her obsession over rules and control was finally facing the consequences, and I couldn't help but think how absurd it all was. I mean, seriously, she had been arrested over garden gnomes and mailbox colors. Suburban drama doesn't get more ridiculous than that. But beyond the humor, there was a sense of justice. For months, Karen had used fear, intimidation, and petty rules to manipulate and control. She had underestimated me, underestimated my family, and underestimated the fact that sometimes real authority is more than just a clipboard and a loud voice. Sometimes real authority is law, fairness, and common sense. The neighborhood felt different after that. Peaceful, free. People smiled as they passed by, some making small jokes about the Karen crisis that had shaken the street. Even my garden gnomes seemed to stand taller, proud survivors of the HOA war. I reflected on the whole experience while sipping my coffee on the porch, feeling the weight of months of tension lift. Leaving the HOA had been a simple decision, a choice for freedom and sanity, but it had escalated into something that felt almost cinematic. The confrontation with Karen, the calls, the emails, the driveway blockades, they all seemed part of some suburban epic, culminating in the moment when reality caught up with fantasy. And the best part, Karen finally learned a lesson she couldn't argue with. You can't bully people forever, and sometimes the consequences come from places you least expect. The sheriff, in his calm, professional way, had restored order, and I had my life back. As I watched the squad car drive away with Karen inside, I took a deep breath, smiled, and muttered to myself, "Never mess with a neighborhood when the law is in your family." It was over, the HOA terror had ended. The street was quiet again, my garden gnomes were safe, and I could finally enjoy the simple pleasure of a coffee on the porch without fear of a neon sign threatening my existence. Sometimes suburban life gives you absurdity, sometimes it gives you drama, and sometimes it gives you poetic justice served cold with a side of humor right in front of your neighbors. And that, my friends, is how HOA Karen finally met her match and learned the hard way that not every battle can be won with a clipboard and a scowl. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.